Case 1. Holly Renee Rutledge. March 28, 2015, Whitwell, Tennessee. A 5-year-old boy named Lucas Dillon was already dying when the first responder kicked in the door. The baseball bat told the story before anyone could lie about it. Blood spatter on the carpet, fractures in a small skull, impact patterns that didn't match a fall, didn't match an accident, didn't match anything except the truth. Someone swung that bat with force. Someone aimed it at a child who couldn't fight back. This isn't about monsters hiding in the shadows. This is about the women who were supposed to protect them and chose violence instead. The mothers who should have been their safe place. The ones who fed them, bathed them, tucked them in at night, and then became the reason they never woke up. Over the next hour, you're going to meet 10 mothers from Tennessee who didn't just fail their children. They destroyed them. Some used their fists. Some used drugs. Some used starvation. One used a plastic bag and waited 10 years to confess. These aren't urban legends. These aren't sensationalized tabloid stories. These are court records, autopsy reports, verdicts read aloud in courtrooms where families wept and juries couldn't look the defendants in the eye. Before we go further, if you're here for real crime stories that don't sugarcoat the truth, hit that subscribe button. We cover cases the algorithm doesn't want you to see. The ones that make people uncomfortable. The ones that need to be told anyway. Real quick, drop a comment and tell me, where are you watching from right now? I want to know who's here with me for this. So let's go back to that house in Whitwell. The responders saw it immediately. The blood spatter on the walls wasn't consistent with a tumble off a couch or a slip on the stairs. It was cast off. The kind you get when something heavy and blunt swings through the air, makes contact with bone, and keeps moving. The skull fractures told the same story. Multiple impact sites. Depressed fractures where the bone caved inward under pressure. The medical examiner didn't need long to rule out the fall. The bat's trajectory, the angle of the blows, the sheer force required, it all pointed to one thing. Someone stood over Lucas Dillon and swung. Law enforcement started piecing it together fast. There were bruise patterns on Lucas's arms and torso that suggested defensive wounds, small hands trying to block what was coming. No signs of forced entry. No evidence of an intruder, no external suspects. The focus narrowed to the people inside that house, and one name kept surfacing. Holly Renee Rutledge. She was the father's girlfriend. She was the primary caregiver that day. She was the one who called 911, and her story kept changing. First, it was a fall. Then it was an accident. Then it was something about Lucas being clumsy, about him running into things, but the forensic pathologist who took the stand later would shut that down with one sentence. The energy transfer matched a heavy wooden bat swung at close range, not a fall from furniture. Holly's defensive posture during questioning raised red flags. She avoided eye contact. She contradicted herself. She couldn't explain the blood spatter. She couldn't explain the bat. And when investigators pressed her on the timeline, the gaps in her story grew wider. Lucas Dillon was 5 years old. He liked toy trucks. He had a gap-toothed smile that his grandmother said could light up a room. He was the kind of kid who still believed in superheroes, who thought grown-ups were safe, who didn't know that the person watching him that day would be the one to take everything from him. This was Whitwell, population 1,700. Everyone knew everyone. People didn't lock their doors. Kids played outside until the streetlights came on. And now a little boy was dead, and the whole town was trying to make sense of it. This wasn't an accident. Accidents don't leave blood on the walls. Accidents don't fracture a skull in multiple places. This was a choice. Someone picked up that bat, someone swung it, someone kept swinging it, and then someone lied about it. Holly Renee Rutledge was indicted on first-degree murder and aggravated child abuse. The prosecution pushed hard. This was intentional, this was brutal, this was a defenseless child. But in June 2017, the Marion County jury acquitted her on those top counts. Instead, they convicted her of reckless homicide and aggravated assault. The distinction mattered legally. The jury concluded the fatal injuries arose from a culpably careless act rather than premeditated intent. It was a compromise verdict, the kind that tries to split the difference between what happened and what can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense leaned into the idea of a momentary loss of control, a single terrible lapse in judgment. But the prosecution hammered back. You don't lose control multiple times. You don't accidentally swing a bat more than once. Repeated blows aren't a moment, they're a decision over and over again. In August 2017, Judge Eddie Avalon sentenced Holly Rutledge to 10 years in prison, 4 for reckless homicide, 6 for aggravated assault, served consecutively. The courtroom erupted. Families wept. Community members walked out shaking their heads. 10 years for a child's life felt like a slap in the face. But the law has limits. Jury instructions have boundaries. And sometimes justice doesn't feel like justice at all. Holly Rutledge is currently listed in Tennessee Department of Correction records. There's no confirmed release date as of late 2025. Parole eligibility depends on time served, behavior, and a system that weighs rehabilitation against the weight of what was done. Somewhere in an evidence locker, that blood-spattered baseball bat still sits, tagged and cataloged, a silent witness to a little boy who never got to grow up. Holly Rutledge blamed a loss of control. But what happens when a mother plans the cover-up before the crime even happens? Case 2, Robin Rebecca Howington, September 14, 2019, Fountain City, Knoxville. The 911 call came in frantic, a mother screaming that her 5-year-old daughter had been shot. Robin Howington's voice cracked as she told the dispatcher an intruder had broken in. Then the story shifted. Maybe it was the child's father. Wait, no. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe her toddler found the gun and it just went off. The story kept changing, morphing with every question, every pause, every second that ticked by. But a neighbor's security camera caught something Robin didn't know was being recorded. The footage was damning, time-stamped, clear. Just minutes after that 911 call, Robin Howington walked out of her house, looked around, and crept toward the shrubbery at the edge of her yard. She pulled a 9mm handgun from her waistband and shoved it deep into the bushes, covering it with leaves. Then she went back inside and waited for the police to arrive. She was calm, methodical. This wasn't panic, this was calculation. When investigators recovered that gun, ballistics told the rest of the story. The bullet had traveled through Destiny Oliver's hand first. Her tiny palm, fingers spread, maybe reaching for the remote, maybe trying to push the gun away. Then it tore through the TV remote she'd been holding. Then it entered her chest. The trajectory was clean, linear, and absolutely inconsistent with an intruder firing from a doorway or window. Forensic experts testified there was no entry wound, no angle, no scenario where someone outside that home could have caused this injury. The shot came from inside, from close range, and the gun had been in that house the whole time. Robin's 911 panic didn't match her behavior on that security footage. She sounded hysterical on the phone, but minutes later she was steady enough to hide a murder weapon. She invented an intruder, then blamed the father, then pivoted to a toddler's accident. All while the evidence sat buried in her yard. The contrast was stark, and it unraveled her entire defense. Destiny Oliver was 5 years old. She had a smile that her teachers said could brighten the worst days. She loved cartoons and mac and cheese and playing outside until the sun went down. She was innocent in every sense of the word, too young to understand what a gun could do, too trusting to think the adults around her would let something like this happen. But the gun was there, loaded, accessible, left within reach in a house with small children. And on September 14, 2019, that choice became fatal. This wasn't just negligence. This was reckless endangerment with a body count. Robin Howington didn't pull the trigger, but she created the conditions. She left a loaded firearm where a child could find it. She failed to secure it. She failed to protect Destiny. And when it all went wrong, she tried to cover it up. Prosecutors charged Robin Howington with reckless homicide, 2 counts of aggravated child neglect, evidence tampering, attempted tampering with evidence, and filing a false report. The defense tried to paint her as a mother overwhelmed by stress, someone who made a terrible mistake in a moment of panic. But the prosecution hammered the premeditation angle. You don't accidentally hide a gun. You don't accidentally lie to 911. You don't accidentally invent multiple false narratives unless you know you're guilty. In March 2024, a Knox County jury returned guilty verdicts on every count except felony murder. The courtroom was silent as the verdicts were read. Robin showed no emotion. Destiny's family wept. On April 19, 2024, Judge Scott Green sentenced Robin Howington to 22 years in the Tennessee Department of Correction. Under Tennessee's violent offender statutes, she must serve at least 85% of that sentence before she's eligible for parole. That's over 18 years. Judge Green's remarks were measured but firm. This was a preventable tragedy, a failure of responsibility, and a betrayal of the most fundamental duty a caregiver has. Community response was split. Some felt relief that justice had been served, that Destiny's death wouldn't go unanswered. Others pointed to the inadequacy of Tennessee's safe storage laws. There's no statute requiring gun owners to lock up firearms in homes with children. Destiny's case became a rallying cry for advocates pushing for stronger legislation. But for her family, no sentence, no law, no verdict could bring her back. Somewhere in Fountain City, there's an empty swing set in a yard where yellow crime scene tape once fluttered in the wind. It's faded now, but the memory hasn't. Robin Howington tried to rewrite the story in real time. But our next case? The evidence was hidden in plain sight for years, until a toddler's autopsy revealed the poison in the home. I know these stories are heavy, but they matter. If you think this kind of journalism deserves a bigger platform, smash that like button and share this video. The algorithm buries true crime. We only grow if you help. Case 3, Prestina Clark-Wilcox, July 9, 2020, Antioch, Davidson County. 3-year-old Paris Clark-Wilcox was found unresponsive in her mother's apartment. First responders walked into a scene that made their stomachs turn. Drug residue on the coffee table, on the kitchen counter, on the nightstand next to the bed where Paris slept. Paraphernalia scattered across surfaces a toddler could reach. Powder in plastic bags left open, accessible within arm's length of a curious child. The apartment looked like a trap house. Because it was. The Davidson County Medical Examiner's report was unequivocal. Acute fentanyl intoxication. Paris didn't overdose by accident in the way adults do. She didn't choose this. She was 3 years old. She explored the world the way toddlers do, putting things in her mouth, touching everything, tasting what looked interesting. And in that apartment, what looked interesting was death. A small plastic bag recovered from Prestina Clark-Wilcox's mattress contained cocaine and suspected fentanyl. Toxicology confirmed Paris had ingested enough fentanyl to kill her. She didn't know the difference between candy and poison. She didn't know that the white powder on the table could stop her heart. She was 3. This wasn't the first red flag. There had been prior reports. Unattended children, visible drug equipment. Concerns raised by neighbors who heard crying through the walls and saw a toddler wandering near the door unsupervised. Child Protective Services had been notified. There were documented risks. People knew. The system knew. And yet Paris was still in that home, still within reach of the drugs, still unprotected. The question that haunted investigators, prosecutors, and the community wasn't just, how did this happen? It was, how was this child still in the home? Systemic failures don't announce themselves with sirens. They happen quietly, in the gaps between reports and follow-ups, in the space where a case file gets shuffled to the bottom of a pile because there are too many cases and not enough caseworkers. Paris Clark-Wilcox fell through one of those gaps, and it killed her. In April 2021, a grand jury indicted Prestina Clark-Wilcox on first-degree murder, aggravated child neglect, and aggravated child endangerment. The charges reflected the severity of what had happened. A child dead because her mother chose drugs over safety, over supervision, over the most basic duty of keeping her alive. But in June 2022, Prestina pled guilty to a reduced charge, criminally negligent homicide. The distinction mattered. First-degree murder requires intent, premeditation, a conscious decision to kill. Criminally negligent homicide acknowledges gross negligence, a failure so reckless, so careless, that it results in death. The prosecution framed it as a mother who knew the risks and ignored them. The defense framed it as addiction, as a disease that impaired judgment, as tragedy rather than malice. The court imposed an 8-year sentence in the Tennessee Department of Correction. With earned credits and statutory requirements, Prestina could be eligible for release in less time. 8 years for a 3-year-old's life. The math never adds up. Paris's death became a flashpoint in the conversation about the fentanyl epidemic. We talk about overdose deaths in terms of users, adults who made choices, who knew the risks, who played with fire. But we don't talk enough about the children in those homes. The toddlers who crawl across floors dusted with residue, the kids who find baggies in couch cushions. The invisible victims of an epidemic that doesn't stop at the user. Fentanyl is so potent that a dose smaller than a grain of salt can be fatal. And in homes where it's present, children are at constant risk. The gaps in DCS intervention are glaring. Documented risk should mean removal. Visible paraphernalia should trigger immediate action. But the system is overwhelmed, underfunded, and stretched so thin that kids like Paris slip through. Her death spotlighted the necessity for proactive Child Protective Services engagement, not reactive, not after the fact, but before a 3-year-old ends up in a morgue. Somewhere in Antioch, Paris's bedroom still exists. Toys scattered on the floor, a stuffed animal on the bed, a life that stopped before it really started. Prestina Clark-Wilcox's addiction killed her daughter, but the system that left Paris in that apartment shares the blame. Prestina's addiction killed her daughter. But what happens when a mother's overdose leaves her child to starve to death, alone, for days? Quick question, what time is it where you are? I'm curious who's watching this late at night versus first thing in the morning. Drop a comment. Case 4. Tiffany Spears, February 9, 2021. Portland, Sumner County. A probation officer knocked on Tiffany Spears's door for a routine welfare check. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. Something felt wrong. He forced entry. What he found inside that house would haunt him for the rest of his life. Tiffany Spears was dead in the bathroom, slumped against the wall. In the bedroom, 15-month-old Nicholas Crowder was strapped into a car seat on the floor. He was dead too. His tiny body was emaciated, his skin pale and sunken. And in another room, a 3-year-old girl, dehydrated, weak, barely able to stand, was found alive. Scattered around her were eggshell fragments and dried egg residue smeared on the floor. Investigators pieced it together quickly. The 3-year-old had tried to feed her baby brother. She'd cracked eggs. She'd tried to reach him. She didn't know he was already gone. Tiffany Spears's autopsy revealed acute combined fentanyl and methamphetamine toxicity. The medical examiner ruled it accidental, an overdose, not a suicide, not a homicide. She died quickly, likely within minutes of ingesting the fatal dose. But Nicholas didn't die quickly. His autopsy told a different, slower, more agonizing story. Starvation and hypernatremic dehydration. His little body had shut down from lack of food and water. The timeline reconstruction was brutal. Nicholas outlived his mother by days, maybe a week. Strapped in that car seat, unreachable, dying inch by inch while his sister tried desperately to help him. Imagine what that 3-year-old saw. Imagine what she heard. Her baby brother crying, then whimpering, then going silent. Her mother unresponsive in the bathroom. No one coming, no one answering. She tried to crack eggs because that's what she'd seen adults do. She tried to feed him because she didn't understand why he wouldn't wake up. What does a child that young remember? What does she carry? Therapists will work with her for years, but some things don't leave. Some things become the foundation of who you are, whether you remember them clearly or not. No criminal charges were filed. The Sumner County medical examiner ruled both deaths accidental. Tiffany's overdose was unintentional. Nicholas's death, while horrific, was the result of his mother's incapacitation, not a deliberate act of harm. There was no one left to charge, no perpetrator to arrest. The legal system looked at the scene and concluded, tragedy, not crime. But is that justice? Or is that the system admitting it has no language for a crime this bleak? Tiffany Spears didn't strap her son into that car seat intending to overdose and leave him to starve. But she did leave him vulnerable. She did use drugs in a home with 2 small children. She did create the conditions that led to his death. And yet, because there was no intent, no malice, no surviving defendant, the law had nothing to say. Nicholas Crowder died alone, and no one was held accountable. The systemic lessons are painful but clear. Addiction isolates families. It cuts them off from friends, from relatives, from the people who might check in and notice something's wrong. Tiffany was on probation. Someone was supposed to be monitoring her. But welfare checks are sporadic, under-resourced, and often too late. The probation officer who found the bodies has to live with the timing. If he'd checked 1 week earlier, Nicholas might still be alive. 1 week. That's the margin between life and death when you're 15 months old and no one's coming. Policy implications are obvious but rarely implemented. Mandatory frequent welfare checks for parents with documented substance use histories and young children. Home visits, unannounced check-ins. Systems that don't wait for a missed appointment to raise a red flag. Nicholas Crowder's death should have been preventable. It wasn't inevitable. It was the result of gaps in oversight and intervention in a system that moves too slowly to save children who are dying in real time. Somewhere in an evidence room there's an empty car seat. Small, worn, stained. It's tagged and stored, a relic of a case that was closed without charges, without a trial, without anyone to blame except a dead woman and a system that didn't move fast enough. Tiffany Spears didn't mean to kill her son. Our next case, there's no gray area, just a mother with a camera and 3 daughters. Case 5, Crystal Renee Dawn Poore. Mid-2014, federal investigators with the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force received a tip. Digital evidence, phones, cloud backups, file transfers, led them to a home in Tennessee. What they found on those devices was unspeakable. 3 little girls, ages 2, 6, and 8, and their mother behind the camera. Crystal Renee Dawn Poore didn't just abuse her daughters, she filmed it, and she tried to sell it. The digital nightmare investigators uncovered wasn't a single incident, wasn't a moment of poor judgment or a lapse in control. This was systematic. This was planned. This was a business model. Crystal used electronic devices to record her 3 daughters engaged in sexual acts. She stored the images. She attempted to distribute them. She turned her own children into commodities. The ICAC task force, which exists specifically to detect and interrupt these cycles of exploitation, moved fast. Seized phones revealed incontrovertible evidence, timestamps, metadata, cloud backups that couldn't be erased. There was no ambiguity, no room for defense. The evidence was absolute. The betrayal here goes beyond words. A mother is supposed to be a child's first line of defense, the person who keeps them safe when the world is dangerous, the one who teaches them that their bodies are their own, that no one has the right to hurt them. Crystal Poore inverted that. She became the predator, she was the danger, and her daughters had no one to run to because the person who should have protected them was the one holding the camera. ICAC task forces operate in the darkest corners of the internet, tracking down predators who exploit children for profit, for power, for perversion. They rescue kids from trafficking rings, from abusive households, from situations most people can't even imagine. But even for seasoned investigators, cases like this, where the perpetrator is the mother, hit differently. It's a violation of something fundamental. It shatters the assumption that mothers by default love their children. Crystal Poore proved that assumption wrong. Federal prosecutors moved quickly. In July 2014, Crystal pled guilty to 3 counts of production of child pornography in the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Tennessee. There was no trial, no drawn-out legal battle. The evidence was overwhelming, and she knew it. On November 10, 2014, Judge Thomas Green sentenced her to 27 years in federal prison, followed by lifetime supervised release. 27 years. No parole. Federal sentences don't allow for it. She'll serve every day of that sentence, and when she's released, she'll be monitored for the rest of her life. Judge Green's remarks from the bench were measured but unequivocal. This was a profound betrayal of trust, a systematic exploitation of the most vulnerable victims, and a crime that warranted the maximum severity the law allowed. The psychological and social impact of what Crystal Poore did will outlast her prison sentence. These girls will carry this for the rest of their lives. Trauma doesn't have an expiration date. Therapy can help, support systems can help, but the scars remain. And there's another layer of harm that's unique to digital exploitation: permanence. Every image lives forever online. Even if law enforcement takes down the files, even if the platforms cooperate, those images can be copied, shared, re-uploaded. The violation doesn't end when the abuse stops. It echoes across time, across servers, across the dark web. Those girls will grow up knowing that somewhere someone might still have those images. That's a kind of theft that can never be fully undone. The community was in shock. This was a mother in Tennessee, not some faceless predator on the dark web, not a stranger in a van. A mother. Someone who should have been safe. It shattered assumptions. It made people question what they thought they knew about evil, about family, about the people living next door. Somewhere in an evidence locker, confiscated devices sit sealed in plastic bags. Phones, hard drives, cloud account printouts. They're tagged, cataloged, stored as proof of what happened. And 3 girls are somewhere else, trying to rebuild lives that were stolen from them before they were old enough to understand what was being taken. Crystal Poore exploited her daughters for profit. But neglect can be just as deadly, especially when 2 caregivers are in the home and both turn away. I want to pause for a second. If you've made it this far, you're not just watching, you're bearing witness. These stories don't go viral. They don't get recommended. They survive because people like you share them. So if this matters to you, hit that share button. Send it to someone who needs to hear it. Case 6. Priscila Mota, December 13th, 2022. Nashville hospital staff made a call that would trigger a criminal investigation. A 9-month-old girl had been brought in with life-threatening skull fractures. A 2-year-old boy arrived with chronic diaper rash so severe it had caused open sores along with bruising and clear signs of malnutrition. Medical personnel recognized the injuries immediately. These weren't accidents. This was abuse. This was neglect. And both children lived with their mother, Priscila Mota, and her partner, Santos Lang. But here's the part that made investigators' blood run cold. Both children had been removed once before and returned. The medical findings were horrific. The infant had multiple skull fractures, a subdural hematoma, and retinal hemorrhages. The kind of injuries that come from violent shaking or blunt force trauma. Non-accidental injury, the doctors called it. There's no fall, no accident, no explanation that fits except intentional harm. Someone hurt this baby. Someone struck her, shook her, caused trauma severe enough to fracture her skull in multiple places. She was 9 months old. The toddler's condition told a different but equally devastating story. Skin lesions from untreated diaper rash, dehydration, malnutrition. His body showed the markers of prolonged neglect, not a bad day, not a rough week, but sustained deprivation. He was underweight, his growth stunted, his skin covered in sores that should have been treated weeks earlier. This wasn't a bad week. This was systematic starvation and violence. This was a child left to suffer day after day in a home where 2 adults were present and both turned away. And here's the part that haunts everyone who looked at this case. There were prior child removal orders from 2021. The Department of Children's Services had been involved. These children had been taken out of Priscila Mota's custody once before. Someone somewhere in the system evaluated the home and decided it was safe to return them. Someone signed off on reunification. Someone looked at the case file, looked at the history, and concluded that these children would be okay. How did these children end up back in this home? The systemic failure here is glaring. DCS involvement should mean protection. It should mean that once a child is removed from a dangerous environment, they don't go back until it's genuinely safe. But the system is overwhelmed. Caseworkers carry impossible loads. Reunification is often the goal, even when it shouldn't be. And so children get re-exposed to harmful environments despite prior intervention. The gap between we removed them once and we returned them to the same danger is where kids like this 9-month-old and 2-year-old fall through. The accountability question is uncomfortable but necessary. Who signed off on reunification? Who reviewed this case and decided it was safe? And what happens to them now that 2 children nearly died? Authorities charged Priscila Mota and her partner, Santos Lang, with attempted criminal homicide and aggravated child abuse. The charges reflected the severity. These weren't accidents, these weren't lapses in judgment. These were crimes. In January 2024, Priscila Mota pled guilty to aggravated child endangerment, a reduced charge that acknowledged her role in creating the conditions that nearly killed her children. The court sentenced her to 12 years in the Tennessee Department of Correction. 12 years for 2 children who will carry the scars, physical and psychological, for the rest of their lives. Santos Lang's case was still pending at the time of reporting, the legal process grinding forward while the children he helped harm try to heal. Somewhere in a Nashville hospital, there's a crib where that 9-month-old spent weeks recovering. A stuffed animal sits on the blanket left behind by a nurse who wanted her to have something soft to hold. The children survived, barely. They're in foster care now, in homes where people feed them, where diaper rash gets treated, where no one fractures their skulls. but survival isn't the same as being okay. They'll grow up with questions, they'll grow up with trauma, and they'll grow up knowing the people who were supposed to protect them were the ones who hurt them most. Priscila Mota's children survived, barely. But starvation doesn't have to be fast to be murder. Case 7, Amanda and Matthew Dotson, May 2012, Roane County, Tennessee. 2-year-old Clifford Dotson was transported to medical care, and the staff who received him couldn't believe what they were seeing. He weighed 12 pounds. 12. His body was skeletal, emaciation so severe that every rib protruded, his eyes sunken deep into his skull, his skin stretched tight over bones that should have been padded with the healthy fat of a toddler. The medical cause of death was acute malnutrition. Starvation. A 2-year-old should weigh around 30 pounds. Clifford weighed less than most newborns. He had been starved to death. Investigators went to the mobile home where Clifford had lived, and what they found was a house of horrors. Clifford had been confined to a locked car seat. Not for a car ride, not for safety. Locked in, day after day, unable to move, unable to escape. He was fed infrequently, sporadically, inconsistently, just enough to keep him barely alive, but never enough to thrive, never enough to grow. The home itself was squalid. Blocked plumbing meant waste piled up. Untreated medical issues went ignored. The air inside was thick with neglect, with the smell of decay, with the evidence of 2 adults who had stopped caring whether their child lived or died. And here's the part that makes this case so unbearable. There was food in that house. Amanda and Matthew Dotson ate. They fed themselves. They had access to groceries, to meals, to the resources that could have kept Clifford alive, but they didn't give it to him. While Clifford starved, his parents ate. They made a choice every single day to withhold food from a 2-year-old who was wasting away in front of them. This wasn't poverty. This wasn't a lack of resources. This was deliberate deprivation. This was murder by starvation. A 6-year-old sibling was also in the home. That child was removed during the investigation and placed in protective care. What did that 6-year-old see? What did they hear? Did they watch their baby brother cry from hunger, watch him grow weaker, watch him fade? The trauma of witnessing that kind of slow death doesn't leave. It becomes part of who you are. Amanda and Matthew Dotson were both charged, but their legal outcomes diverged. In 2018, Amanda Dotson pled guilty to facilitation of first-degree murder and aggravated child neglect. She admitted she helped, that she enabled, that she stood by while her son starved. The court sentenced her to a combined 40 years in prison, 40 years for watching a child die and doing nothing to stop it. Matthew Dotson went to trial. In February 2019, a jury convicted him of first-degree felony murder in the perpetration of aggravated child abuse and neglect. The distinction mattered. This wasn't just neglect, wasn't just a failure to act. This was murder. The jury concluded that Matthew Dotson willfully imposed starvation on his son, and that starvation was the method of killing. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He will die behind bars. The Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals upheld the conviction and in doing so affirmed a critical legal principle. Starvation is a valid murder method when willfully imposed. State v. Dotson became precedent. It reshaped how courts in Tennessee view chronic abusive neglect. It established that withholding food from a dependent child, knowing it will result in death, is not just neglect, it's murder. Murder by deprivation. Clifford's death sparked legislative discussions and advocacy efforts aimed at creating clearer definitions of neglect as homicide. The murder by deprivation framework gained traction. Lawmakers and child welfare advocates pushed for systemic changes, better monitoring of at-risk families, mandatory reporting standards, and legal language that doesn't let parents hide behind the word neglect when what they've done is kill. Clifford Dotson's name became a rallying cry for reform, a reminder that the law must recognize slow violence as violence nonetheless. Somewhere in an evidence locker, Clifford's car seat still sits. Small, worn, stained. It's the place where he spent his final days, locked in, starving, unreachable. It's a relic of a case that changed the law and a life that should never have ended this way. The Dotsons starved their son to death over months. But what if the murder happens in minutes and then stays hidden for 10 years? One more question before we keep going. What's the weather like where you are right now? I want to know if you're weathering a storm or watching the sunset. Case 8, Zohal Sakwal, June 15, 2010, Nashville. A 4-month-old baby named Natalie was found deceased in her crib. The initial investigation concluded it was likely sudden infant death syndrome or accidental suffocation. Maybe a blanket, maybe positional asphyxia, maybe one of those tragic, unexplainable losses that devastate families and leave no one to blame. The medical examiner signed off. The case was closed. Natalie was buried. Life moved on. And then, 10 years later, the phone rang. January 31st, 2020. Zohal Sakwal contacted the Metro Nashville Police Department's Youth Services Division. She had something to say, something she'd been carrying for a decade. She confessed that she had intentionally suffocated her daughter Natalie with a plastic bag. She staged the scene to make it look accidental. She destroyed evidence. She lied to investigators. She attended the funeral. She lived with the secret for 10 years, and then, for reasons she may not fully understand herself, she picked up the phone and told the truth. The confession was voluntary. No one was pressuring her. No new evidence had surfaced. No witness had come forward. This was guilt, pure, unbearable, decade-old guilt finally breaking through. Zohal described how she placed the plastic bag over Natalie's face, how she held it there, how she waited. Then she removed it, arranged the blankets, and called for help. She played the role of the devastated mother. She answered investigators' questions. She accepted condolences, and she buried the truth along with her daughter. What do you carry for 10 years before it becomes unbearable? What does that weight feel like? Psychologists who study delayed confessions in infanticide cases talk about guilt thresholds, the point at which the internal torment of keeping a secret outweighs the fear of consequences. Some people never reach that threshold. They take the secret to the grave. But Zohal Sakwal reached it. Maybe it was a triggering event, a birthday, an anniversary, another child. Maybe it was cumulative, the slow erosion of her ability to live with what she'd done. Maybe she just couldn't look at herself in the mirror anymore. Whatever the reason, she confessed, and the case that had been closed for a decade was suddenly wide open. In March 2020, Nashville authorities arrested Zohal Sakwal and charged her with first-degree murder, evidence tampering, and filing false reports. Bond was set at $200,000. The legal process began: arraignment, hearings, motions. But as of late 2025, the case remains pending. No trial, no verdict, no sentence. Public records show the case is still active, still winding its way through the courts, still unresolved. Natalie has been dead for 15 years, and her mother still hasn't faced a jury. Community reaction was a mix of shock, disbelief, and anger. How did this slip through in 2010? How did investigators miss it? The initial ruling of SIDS or accidental suffocation wasn't negligent. Infant deaths are notoriously difficult to investigate, and in 2010, forensic standards were less rigorous than they are today. But the case highlights the imperative for rigorous scrutiny of all infant deaths. Every unexplained death should be treated as suspicious until proven otherwise. Every scene should be processed with the assumption that something might be hidden. because sometimes it is. The forensic gaps between 2010 and 2020 are significant. Advances in autopsy techniques, toxicology, and scene reconstruction have made it harder to conceal infanticide. But those advances don't help if the case is closed before they're applied. Zohal Sakwal's confession revealed a murder that had been hiding in plain sight, filed away as a tragedy, mourned and forgotten by everyone except the person who caused it. Somewhere in Nashville, Natalie's nursery might still exist, untouched, preserved, a shrine to a baby who never got to grow up. Or maybe it's been repainted, repurposed, turned into something else. Either way, the memory remains. The loss remains. And the question remains, how many other SIDS cases are actually something darker? Zohal Sakwal confessed, but what happens when a mother helps hide 2 bodies and kidnap 2 children and calls it loyalty? Case 9. Mary Frances Mays, April 27, 2012. Whiteville, Tennessee. Adam Mays walked into the home of Joanne Bain and her 3 daughters. He murdered Joanne. He murdered 14-year-old Adrian. Then he abducted the 2 younger girls, Alexandria, 12, and Kylia, 8. He forced them into a vehicle along with his wife, Teresa Mays, and drove across state lines into Mississippi. Behind his mother's house, he dug shallow graves and buried Joanne and Adrian's bodies in the dirt. 2 girls were still alive, hidden somewhere, terrified, and in the hands of a man who had already killed twice. And the clock was ticking. Law enforcement moved fast. An Amber Alert went out immediately, spreading across Tennessee, Mississippi, and neighboring states. Media coverage was relentless. Tips poured in. The FBI joined the search. Multi-state coordination kicked into high gear. This wasn't just a local case anymore. This was a race against time to find 2 children before they became victims 3 and 4. Investigators tracked Adam Mays's movements, followed leads, pieced together witness statements. And on May 10, 2012, 13 days after the abduction, officers located Alexandria and Kylia alive in a wooded area in Mississippi. They were with Adam Mays, and as law enforcement closed in, he raised a gun to his own head and pulled the trigger. He died at the scene. The girls were safe, but they weren't okay. Alexandria and Kylia survived. But they'd seen everything. They'd watched their mother and sister be murdered. They'd been forced into a car, driven across state lines, held captive for nearly 2 weeks by a man who had killed their family. They'd lived in fear, not knowing if they'd be next, not knowing if anyone was coming for them. Trauma like that doesn't fade. It becomes part of your story, part of who you are. The rescue was a victory for law enforcement, but for those girls it was just the beginning of a long, painful road to recovery. Teresa Mays, Adam's wife, was arrested and charged. She pled guilty to second-degree murder and especially aggravated kidnapping. The court sentenced her to 35 years in prison. She had been there. She had participated. She had helped her husband commit these crimes, and the law held her accountable. But there was another woman involved, another person who knew what Adam had done and chose to help him anyway. Mary Frances Mays, Adam's mother. She admitted to aiding in the confinement of the abducted girls. She admitted to helping hide the bodies of Joanne and Adrian. She knew her son had murdered 2 people. She knew he was holding 2 children against their will. And instead of calling the police, instead of protecting those girls, she protected him. In 2013, Mary Frances Mays pled guilty to 2 counts of especially aggravated kidnapping. The plea agreement was strategic. It spared Alexandria and Kylia from having to testify in court, from having to relive the horror in front of a jury, from facing the woman who had helped keep them captive. The court sentenced her to 13.5 years in prison, acknowledging the severity of her complicity in her son's crimes. She wasn't the one who pulled the trigger. She wasn't the one who dug the graves, but she was the one who made it possible. She was the one who chose loyalty to a murderer over the lives of two innocent children. This is what happens when maternal allegiance overrides protective instincts. Mary Frances Mays looked at two terrified little girls and chose her son. She looked at two dead bodies and chose her son. She had a choice: call the police, save the girls, stop the violence, and she chose complicity. She chose to be part of the crime instead of part of the solution. Mothers are supposed to protect children, all children, not just their own. But Mary Frances Mays drew a line, and on one side was her son, and on the other side was everyone else, and she chose him. The Amber Alert worked. Multi-state cooperation saved lives. Law enforcement agencies across Tennessee and Mississippi coordinated, shared information, and acted fast. Alexandria and Kylia are alive today because the system functioned the way it's supposed to. Because people cared. Because investigators didn't stop until those girls were found. Somewhere Alexandria and Kylia are moving forward. They're resilient. They survived something most people can't imagine. They've rebuilt their lives piece by piece, day by day. They carry scars, but they also carry strength. And they know that when it mattered most, people fought for them. Mary Frances Mays hid bodies to protect her son. But our final case: a mother gave birth in a meth house and threw her baby away like trash. Case 10. Wanda Cieslak, mid-October 2011, La Follette and Campbell County. Wanda Cieslak gave birth to a full-term baby inside a house that had been quarantined as a methamphetamine production site. Not a hospital, not a clinic, not even a clean bedroom, a meth house, a place saturated with toxic chemicals, fumes that could burn your lungs, residue on every surface. And in that environment, a baby was born. On October 21st, deputies responding to a call discovered a newborn's body in a black trash bag on a neighbor's porch. The baby was wrapped in bloody blankets, discarded like garbage. This baby never had a name, never had a chance. The Campbell County medical examiner ruled the manner of death as asphyxiation. The baby had been suffocated, deliberately, not accidentally. Toxicology results showed that Wanda Cieslak was under the influence of oxycodone and other narcotics at the time of delivery. She gave birth while high, in a contaminated house with no medical assistance, no sterile environment, no plan to keep the child alive. The crime scene told a story that contradicted any possibility of accidental suffocation. There were no signs of an attempt to save the baby, no call for help. No effort to resuscitate, just a newborn wrapped in blankets soaked with blood, placed in a trash bag and left on someone else's property. This wasn't a home. This was a chemical disaster. Meth production leaves behind residue that clings to walls, floors, furniture, residue that's toxic to adults and lethal to infants. The air inside a meth house is poison. The surfaces are poison. And Wanda Cieslak chose to give birth there. She chose to bring a baby into that environment, and then she chose to end that baby's life before it ever really began. The intersection of addiction and motherhood is complicated, but this isn't a gray area. This is a newborn in a trash bag. In December 2011, a grand jury indicted Wanda Cieslak on first-degree murder and aggravated child abuse. Preliminary hearings established probable cause. There was enough evidence to move forward, enough to suggest that this wasn't an accident, that this was a crime. But public records on the case are sparse. There's limited coverage of a conviction or sentencing. The case vanished from headlines, but the baby's death didn't. Somewhere in the system, this case exists. Somewhere there's a file with autopsy photos, toxicology reports, and evidence logs. But the public follow-through? Almost non-existent. It's a reminder that not every case gets the attention it deserves, that some stories slip through the cracks of media coverage and public memory. The intersection of untreated addiction and the absence of prenatal care is deadly. Wanda Cieslak was pregnant using drugs and living in a meth house. No one intervened. No one reached her, and a baby died because of it. Community outreach gaps are real. How do we reach pregnant women in active addiction before it's too late? How do we create systems that don't wait for a tragedy to respond? Medical examiners flag suspicious infant deaths, but those flags only matter if someone is paying attention, if someone follows up, if someone demands accountability. Somewhere in an evidence locker, there's a black trash bag, tagged, sealed, a piece of evidence in a case that may never see full justice. Wanda Cieslak's baby was born into a poison house and died in a garbage bag. That's case 10. 10 mothers, 10 children, 10 cases that should never have happened. We've walked through the wreckage of lives destroyed by addiction, by violence, by neglect so severe it became murder. Fentanyl, methamphetamine, opioids, these aren't just substances, they're weapons, and children are the collateral damage. Prestina Clark-Wilcox's daughter Paris ingested fentanyl left within reach. Tiffany Spears overdosed and left her son Nicholas to starve, strapped in a car seat, unreachable. Wanda Cieslak gave birth in a meth house and threw her baby away. Addiction's shadow is long, and it falls hardest on the ones who never chose to be there. Systemic failures run through every one of these cases. Priscila Mota's children were removed once and then returned to the same dangerous home. DCS was involved, people knew, and still those kids ended up back in a place where one nearly died from skull fractures and the other from starvation. The gaps in child protective services aren't just bureaucratic, they're lethal. Replacements without proper oversight, delayed interventions, overworked caseworkers carrying impossible loads. These aren't excuses, they're explanations. And they're not good enough. Legal gray zones complicate justice. Holly Rutledge was acquitted of first-degree murder but convicted of reckless homicide. Robin Howington was found guilty of reckless homicide, not felony murder. The distinction between intentional harm and culpable negligence matters in court, but to the families of Lucas Dillon and Destiny Oliver, it doesn't bring their children back. Neglect as a weapon, starvation, deprivation, withholding care was recognized as murder in the Dotson case, setting a legal precedent. But how many other cases slip through because the law doesn't have language for slow violence? Digital evidence has changed the game. Crystal Poore's phones and cloud backups provided incontrovertible proof of systematic abuse. Robin Howington's neighbor's security camera caught her hiding the murder weapon. Zohal Sakwal's decade-old confession reopened a case that had been closed as SIADs. Technology doesn't lie, it timestamps, it records, it remembers. And it's becoming harder for perpetrators to hide. But here's the truth that cuts deepest. Every single one of these tragedies was preventable. Every case had warning signs, prior reports, visible paraphernalia, bruises, malnutrition, red flags waving in the wind, and no one stopped it in time. These weren't statistics, these were children. Lucas, who liked toy trucks. Destiny, who loved cartoons. Paris, who was 3 years old and curious. Nicholas, who died strapped in a car seat while his sister tried to feed him. Natalie, who was 4 months old when her mother suffocated her. Clifford, who weighed 12 pounds at age 2. Alexandria and Kylea, who survived a kidnapping and watched their mother and sister be murdered. And a nameless newborn born in a meth house and discarded in a trash bag. These were children with favorite toys and bedtime routines and laughter that ended too soon. If you made it to the end, you're part of something bigger than a YouTube video. You're helping make sure these names don't disappear. Subscribe if you haven't. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to support the channel, there's a link in the description. These stories are hard, but they're real. and they're happening in towns just like yours. This is Beneath the Silence. We tell the stories no one else will. I'll see you in the next one.